The cold was a physical thing on the main street of Redemption, Nevada. It sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the road and clung to the clapboard siding of the buildings with a coat of brittle frost. It was the kind of cold that made a man's breath hang in the air like a ghost of a word he wished he'd never spoken. On a wooden bench outside the bakery, where the faint, warm smell of yeast was a cruel mockery, the cold had found its most willing victims. Two girls, barely women, sat huddled together for a warmth that had long since been exhausted. They were twins, identical in their shared misery, their faces pale and streaked with the tracks of silent tears. They were barefoot, their feet tucked beneath the hems of their dresses, a shocking vulnerability against the hard, frozen earth. Their clothes, the thin grey silk of traditional Gyeongsam's, were tattered and stained, garments for a different world, a different life, now reduced to rags in the biting wind of a high desert winter. For 5 days, since the last of their family's charity had run out, this bench had been their home, the gnawing hunger in their bellies a constant, dull ache. Men and women passed, pulling their coats tighter. They saw the girls, of course. It was impossible not to. But they saw them as a problem without a simple solution, a piece of scenery that spoke of a hardship best ignored. They were foreign, alone, and destitute, a triad of misfortune that made decent folk feel both pity and a deep, unsettling unease. Then, a shadow fell over them. It wasn't the passing shadow of a cloud, but the solid, deliberate shape of a man. He stopped a few feet away, not crowding them, but making his presence known. He was tall and broad in a worn sheepskin coat, his face weathered by sun and wind, not old, but carrying the weight of years. His hat was pulled low, but the eyes beneath the brim were clear and steady. He held no judgment, only a quiet, searching attention. For a long moment, he just looked, taking in the bare feet, the thin silk, the way they trembled without seeming to move. He had seen suffering before. He had known it in his own bones. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet air. "You can't stay here," he said. The words were not unkind, but they were a statement of fact, as final as the coming night. One of the sisters, the one who seemed to hold herself a fraction straighter, lifted her head. Her eyes were dark and exhausted, but a flicker of defiance burned in their depths. "We have nowhere to go." Her voice was a whisper, raspy from disuse and dehydration, the English words carefully formed. The man nodded slowly, his gaze moving from her face to her sister, who kept her head bowed, her black hair hiding her expression. He looked back at the first girl. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." He took a half-step closer, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "My name is Jacob. I have a ranch, about a day's ride from here. It's not much, but it's warm. And there's food." The girl's eyes narrowed slightly. In their short, hard life, they had learned that nothing was offered for free, especially by strange men in a strange land. "What do you want?" she asked, the question sharp as a shard of glass. Jacob's gaze didn't waver. He looked at their hands, clasped together in a knot of white knuckles. He saw the way their frames were bird-like, fragile. He had made his decision before he'd even spoken. He had a homestead claim to hold, a herd of cattle to winter, and a silence in his cabin that was becoming too loud to bear. He was a man who acted on necessities, and he saw one standing before him. "I need help," he said, the words simple and honest. "The work is hard. I can't pay you in coin, not right now. But I can offer you a roof, and a share of what we have. Food. Warmth. A place to be." He paused, letting the offer settle in the cold air between them. "It's better than freezing to death on a bench." He looked up at the grey sky, which was beginning to spit tiny, hard pellets of snow. "The storm's coming in for real. You have to decide now." He looked back at them, his expression unreadable but patient. "Prepare to go with me. Or don't." The defiant sister, Lynn, looked at her twin, Sue. Sue finally lifted her head, her face a perfect, heartbreaking mirror of her sister's. Her eyes were filled with a deep, abiding fear, but as she met Lynn's gaze, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a choice made not out of hope, but out of the sheer absence of any other option. Lynn turned back to Jacob. Her chin was high, a small bastion of pride in a sea of desperation. "We will go," she said. Jacob simply nodded. "All right then." He turned and walked toward a wagon hitched a little ways down the street, a sturdy freight wagon loaded with sacks of flour and other supplies. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He knew they would be. There was nowhere else on earth for them to go. The journey to Jacob's homestead was a silent, brutal affair. He helped them onto the wagon seat, wrapping them in a thick, coarse wool blanket from his bedroll. It smelled of horse and clean pine, a scent so different from the city stench they had grown used to. He did not try to make conversation, for which Lynn was grateful. Words felt like a luxury they could not afford. Instead, he simply drove, his hands sure on the reins, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The world outside the small town dissolved into a vast, rolling emptiness of grey hills and skeletal sagebrush. The snow began to fall in earnest, not a gentle dusting but a driving, horizontal assault that quickly coated the landscape in a blanket of white. Sue huddled against Lynn, her small body trembling uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the terrifying scale of the wilderness around them. Lynn wrapped her arms around her sister, trying to project a calm she did not feel. They had traded a slow death in a town for a quick one in the wild, she thought. It was long after dark when Jacob finally pulled the team to a halt. Through the swirling snow, Lynn could just make out the dark shape of a small cabin and a larger barn, hunkered down in the lee of a low ridge. A single, weak yellow light glowed from a window in the cabin. "We're here," Jacob said. He hopped down from the wagon, his movements stiff from the cold. He came around and lifted Sue down as if she weighed nothing, setting her on the sheltered porch. He did the same for Lynn, his hands briefly warm and solid on her waist. For a moment, she was too weak to stand, her legs numb and useless. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch impersonal but firm. "Inside," he commanded, already moving to unhitch the weary horses. "There's a fire in the stove." The cabin was one room. It was brutally simple. A cast-iron stove in one corner radiated a blessed heat. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A single cot was against one wall, and a larger, built-in bunk was against the other. A few shelves held tin plates, a handful of books, and a small, neatly folded piece of cloth. The place was scrubbed clean but profoundly empty. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. Sue went immediately to the stove, holding her hands out to the warmth, her shoulders finally beginning to hunch. Lynn stood in the middle of the room, taking it all in. This was their salvation. It was a bare, hard place, but it was solid. It was real. Jacob came in a few minutes later, shaking snow from his coat. He didn't look at them, but went to a cupboard and took out a block of salt pork and a handful of dried beans. He began preparing a meal without a word, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and solitude. The smell of the food frying was agonizing. Lynn's stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She and Sue had not eaten a real meal in over a week. When Jacob spooned the simple stew of beans and pork into tin bowls and set them on the table, neither sister hesitated. They ate ravenously, hunched over their bowls, forgetting manners, forgetting everything but the desperate need to fill the emptiness inside them. Jacob sat across from them, eating his own portion slowly. He watched them, not with pity, but with a kind of detached curiosity, like a man observing a natural phenomenon. When they were finished, he took their bowls. "There's a loft," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a ladder in the corner. "I put some extra blankets up there. It's the warmest place in the house." He then took his coat from its peg. "I have to see to the stock," and with that, he was gone, back out into the storm. Lynn and Sue climbed the ladder to the small, cramped loft. As he'd promised, there was a thick pile of wool blankets on the rough floorboards. From this vantage point, they could see the whole of the cabin below. They saw the single cot, neatly made. They saw the 2 chairs at the table. They saw the profound, unbreachable solitude of the man who had brought them here. He had offered them shelter, but he had not offered them welcome. Not yet. They were a necessity he had acquired, like a sack of flour or a new axe handle. That night, huddled together under the heavy blankets, with the wind howling outside and the warmth of a full belly spreading through her for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Lynn stared into the darkness and wondered what kind of bargain they had truly made. They had escaped the bench, but they had traded their known misery for an unknown future, in the house of a silent, solitary man whose kindness felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself. The storm raged for 2 days. They were trapped in the small cabin, a triangle of silent strangers. Jacob moved with a quiet, restless energy, mending harnesses at the table, sharpening tools, his hands always busy. He spoke only when necessary, asking them to feed the fire or pass the salt. Lynn and Sue stayed out of his way, retreating to the loft or sitting quietly on a bench by the wall. They learned the rhythms of his silence. They learned the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way he paused by the window to stare out at the white emptiness, his face a mask of old grief. On the third morning, the sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The world was buried in snow. "The drifts will be deep," Jacob said at breakfast. "Some of the herd will have sheltered in the canyons, but some will be trapped. I have to go find them." Lynn stood up. "We will help." Jacob looked at her, then at Sue. He saw their thin frames, their city-soft hands. He almost refused, but then he saw the look in Lynn's eyes. It was the same defiance he'd seen on the bench in town. It was not a plea. It was a statement. They were not here to be sheltered pets. They were here to work. "All right," he said slowly. "But you do exactly as I say. This isn't a game. The cold will kill you faster than a wolf." He found clothes for them in a trunk at the foot of his bunk. They were men's clothes, worn soft with use. A flannel shirt, thick wool trousers, and a pair of boots for each of them that had belonged to someone smaller than him. The clothes swam on their small frames, but they were warm. As Lynn pulled on a pair of socks, she saw a flash of something inside the trunk. A child's drawing, folded small. She quickly looked away, feeling as if she had trespassed on sacred ground. The work was harder than anything they had ever imagined. They spent the day struggling through waist-deep snow, following Jacob as he tracked the scattered cattle. He showed them how to spot the signs of a cow buried in a drift, how to dig them out, how to get them moving again. His patience was gruff but absolute. He never raised his voice, but his instructions were clear and firm. By late afternoon, they were driving a small group of half-frozen cattle back toward the barn when they saw the rider. It was a woman, perched on a fine-looking mare, her expensive, fur-lined coat a stark contrast to their own rough garments. She sat on the ridge overlooking Jacob's property, watching them. "That's Martha Vance," Jacob said, his voice tight. "Owns the biggest spread in this valley. And she thinks that gives her the right to own everyone in it, too." As if summoned, Martha Vance urged her horse down the slope, stopping a few feet away. She was a woman in her 50s, with a face like a clenched fist and eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze swept over Lynn and Sue, dismissing them as little more than ranch hands, before settling on Jacob. "Jacob," she said, her voice carrying a false, honeyed warmth. "I see you've acquired some new help." "They're earning their keep, Martha," Jacob replied, his tone level. "Are they now?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Funny, the talk in town is that you picked up a pair of strays. Chinese strays, at that. People are wondering what a man like you would want with them." A man living all alone. The insinuation was thick and ugly. Lynn felt a flush of shame and anger heat her face. Sue shrank behind her, trying to disappear into the folds of her oversized coat. Jacob stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of the girls. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "What I do on my own property is my business, Martha. These girls are under my protection. Now, if you don't have any lost cattle on my land, I'd suggest you get back to yours before the sun sets." For a moment, the two of them were locked in a battle of wills. Martha's eyes narrowed. She had expected him to be cowed, to be ashamed. His quiet defiance infuriated her. She looked past him, at Lynn, her eyes filled with a cold contempt. "This is a decent, God-fearing valley," Jacob. People won't stand for impropriety. With a final, withering glare, she wheeled her horse around and rode away, a queen retreating from a battle she had unexpectedly lost. But Lynn knew it was not over. Martha Vance had fired a warning shot. She had made them a public spectacle, a subject for gossip and suspicion. The fragile piece of their new life had been shattered. They were no longer just Jacob's problem. They were the town's. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was no longer peaceful, it was heavy with unspoken things. Jacob was quieter than ever, his thoughts clearly miles away. After the meager dinner, as Lynn and Sue were cleaning the plates, he finally spoke. "She won't let it go," he said, staring into the fire. "Martha likes things neat. She doesn't like loose ends. And right now, you're loose ends." Lynn finished wiping the table and came to stand near the stove. "Why did you help us?" she asked, the question she had been holding for days. "You did not know us. You owe us nothing." Jacob was silent for a long time, tracing the grain of the wooden table with his finger. "I had a family once," he said, his voice low and rough. "A wife." A little girl. He looked up, and for the first time, Lynn saw past the weathered exterior to the deep, hollow ache within him. "Fever took them. Both in the same week. I buried them on a hill just east of here, 2 years ago." He took a breath, the sound of it ragged in the quiet room. "My wife, Sarah, she was from the city. She hated the silence out here. Said it was too loud. After she was gone, I started to understand what she meant." He looked at Lynn, his eyes holding a profound and weary sadness. "I saw you on that bench, and I saw 2 people who had nothing left. And I had too much nothing. I thought, maybe, we could make a different kind of silence. A better 1-inch. The confession hung in the air, a fragile, precious thing. It was more than he had said in all the days they had been there. It was a piece of his heart, offered up in the quiet of the night. Lynn felt something loosen in her own chest. She reached into the pocket of the trousers she wore and pulled out a small, flat object wrapped in silk. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a piece of pale green jade, carved in the shape of a butterfly, but broken, one wing missing. "Our father was a scholar," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "He loved books more than business. He made a bad deal with a man from a trading company in San Francisco. A man named Fang. When our parents died from influenza, this man came. He said our father's debt was now ours. He took everything. Our house, our mother's jewelry. He said the debt was still not paid." Her voice broke, and she fought to control it. Sue, hearing the story, came down the ladder and stood beside her sister, her hand finding Lynn's. Lynn took a steadying breath. "He wanted to take us to work in one of his houses. Our uncle gave us the last of his money and told us to run. To get on a train and go east, as far as we could. To disappear. We ran. But the money ran out in redemption." She looked down at the broken jade in her palm. "This is all we have left of our home." Jacob looked from the broken jade to their faces, and for the first time, he saw them not as strays or as help, but as 2 young women who had fought their own brutal war and somehow survived. The threat of Martha Vance and her town gossip seemed small and petty in comparison. The real danger was not in redemption. It was a ghost from their past, a man named Fang, who could arrive at any moment. And Jacob knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this was a fight he could not turn away from. He had offered them a roof. But what they needed was a fortress. A week passed. The snow melted under a relentless sun, turning the valley into a muddy mess. Life on the ranch fell into a new rhythm, one born of shared work and quiet understanding. Lynn and Sue proved to be quick learners and tireless workers. Sue, who had seemed so fragile, had a preternatural gift with the animals, calming a nervous horse with a soft word and a gentle touch. Lynn, practical and observant, took over the management of the cabin, stretching their meager supplies with an ingenuity that amazed Jacob. The empty cabin began to feel like a home. One afternoon, Jacob was in the barn, repairing a broken axle on the wagon, when he heard the sound of an approaching buggy. It was not Martha Vance's fine carriage. This was a hired rig from town, and the man driving it was a stranger. He was dressed in a black suit that looked out of place and expensive, his face smooth and unreadable. As he stepped down, Lynn came to the door of the cabin, a dish towel in her hand, her face suddenly pale. "Jacob," she said, her voice tight with a fear he had not heard since the first night. The man in the black suit smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his lips. "Good afternoon," he said, his English perfect, his tone oily. "I am looking for two girls. Sisters. They would have come here from the east." He looked directly at Lynn. "Ah. There you are. Your uncle is a fool. He should have known you cannot outrun a debt to Mr. Fang." Jacob put down his hammer and walked slowly out of the barn, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He positioned himself between the man and the cabin door, a silent, solid wall. "You're on private property," Jacob said. "State your business and be on your way." Mr. Fang's eyes flicked to Jacob, taking in the worn clothes, the calloused hands. He dismissed him as a simple farmer. "My business is with the girls. They are property of the Golden Dragon Trading Company, as collateral against their father's debt. I have the contract." He patted his breast pocket. "It is all quite legal." "This is Nevada," Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We have our own laws here. And people aren't property." Fang laughed, a short, unpleasant bark. "Oh, my friend. Everything is property. You, of all people, should know that. This land, these animals." His eye swept the homestead. "And these girls. They are a debt to be collected. You can give them to me now, peacefully. Or I can return with the territorial marshal and a warrant. It will be much messier. But the result will be the same." The threat was real. A contract was a contract, and in a territory desperate for investment and Eastern business, a man like Fang, representing a company from San Francisco, would likely find a sympathetic ear from a judge bought and paid for. Jacob was outmaneuvered. He had no legal standing. He looked back at Lynn. Her face was a mask of terror, but her eyes were pleading with him. Sue was peeking from behind the doorframe, trembling. In that moment, Jacob knew he would not, could not, let them be taken. He had buried a family once. He would not stand by and watch another one be torn apart. "You're not taking them," Jacob said. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Fang's smile widened. "A brave, foolish man. I will be back in 3 days. With the law. Have them ready." He climbed back into his buggy, turned it around in the muddy yard, and drove away, leaving a trail of smug certainty in his wake. The moment he was gone, the fragile calm shattered. Sue began to weep, quiet, desperate sobs. Lynn rushed to comfort her, but her own hands were shaking. Jacob stood in the yard, watching the buggy disappear, his mind racing. 3 days. He had 3 days to fight a legal battle he had no hope of winning. He looked at his ranch, his small piece of the world he had carved out of nothing. He looked at the 2 girls on his porch. He had brought them into this. It was his responsibility to see them through it. He walked into the cabin. He went to the small shelf of books and took one down. It was a dry, heavy volume, Territorial Statutes and Land Claim Law. He opened it on the table. "We're not going to run," he said, his voice firm, pulling them all back from the edge of despair. "We're going to fight." For the next 2 days, the cabin became a war room. Jacob and Lynn pored over the law book, searching for a loophole, a defense. Sue, surprisingly, revealed a hidden talent. Her father had taught her to use an abacus, and her mind for numbers was sharp and quick. She went over the phantom figures of the debt that Lynn remembered, finding inconsistencies, impossibilities. It was a desperate, flimsy defense, but it was something. On the second night, Jacob rode into redemption. He didn't go to the saloon or the general store. He went to the telegraph office. He sent a single, coded message to a name in San Francisco, a contact from a past life he never spoke of. It was a long shot, a favor called in from years ago. He had no idea if it would even be answered. As he rode back to the homestead under a starless sky, the weight of what he had done, of what he was risking, settled on him. The third day dawned cold and clear. An air of dread hung over the ranch. Shortly after noon, 2 buggies appeared on the ridge. One held Mr. Fang. The other held the territorial marshal, a grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his coat, and, to Jacob's dismay, Martha Vance, who sat with a look of vindicated triumph on her face. They pulled up in the yard. The marshal, a man named Bates, dismounted. He looked uncomfortable. "Jacob, I have a warrant here, signed by Judge Miller. It compels you to release the persons known as Lin and Sue into the custody of this man, Mr. Fang, as per the articles of a private debt contract." "Marshal, you know this is wrong," Jacob said, his voice low. "My job isn't to know what's right," Bates said, his eyes avoiding Jacob's. "It's to enforce the law. The judge says the contract is valid in this territory." Fang stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "The game is over, farmer. Get the girls." From the porch, Lynn spoke, her voice clear and strong. "We are not property." Martha Vance sniffed. "You are what the law says you are." Just then, the sound of a horse, ridden hard, echoed from the direction of town. A boy from the telegraph office was galloping toward them, waving a piece of paper. He skidded to a halt, his horse breathing hard. "Mr. Jacob! A wire for you. Came just now." Jacob took the telegraph. As he read, a slow, grim smile touched his lips. He looked up, his eyes finding Fang's. "Marshal," Jacob said, holding out the paper. "You might want to read this." Bates took the flimsy and read it aloud, his voice growing more uncertain with each word. To Jacob Holt. Re. Golden Dragon Trading. Company dissolved 1878. Assets seized for fraud. Principal, Wan Zheng Fang, wanted for questioning. Warrants issued. U.S. Marshal, San Francisco District. A dead silence fell over the yard. Fang's face had gone the color of ash. The smirk was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed look of a cornered rat. "This is a trick," Fang stammered. "A forgery." "Is it?" Jacob asked softly. "The telegraph is a wonderful thing, Mr. Fang. It travels faster than a lie." Marshal Bates looked from the telegraph to Fang, then to Jacob. He was a lawman, and he recognized the name of the San Francisco marshal. He had made a choice to enforce one warrant. Now he had to make a choice about another. He slowly turned to face Fang, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Mr. Fang," Bates said, his voice now cold and official. "I think you'd better come with me. We have some things to discuss." Fang tried to back away, but 2 of Bates's deputies, who had been silent observers until now, stepped forward and took him by the arms. Martha Vance looked on, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her moment of triumph had turned to dust. She spat on the ground, turned her buggy around without a word, and whipped her horse into a trot, eager to distance herself from the unfolding scandal. As the deputies led a protesting Fang away, Marshal Bates stopped in front of Jacob. He looked at Lin and Sue, who were clinging to each other on the porch. He looked at the law book still sitting on the cabin table. He tipped his hat. "Looks like you had it handled, Jacob," he said, a note of respect in his voice. He mounted his horse and followed his deputies back toward town, leaving Jacob, Lin, and Sue alone in the quiet yard. The spring that followed was a time of quiet rebuilding. The shadow of Mr. Fang and the specter of the past were gone, leaving behind not emptiness, but a clean, open space. The ranch, which had been a place of solitude for Jacob and a temporary refuge for the sisters, began to transform. Sue's garden, planted in a patch of earth she had tilled herself, flourished with vegetables they had never tasted before. Lin's sharp mind and Sue's careful accounting turned their small herd into a profitable enterprise, selling milk and cheese in town, where their reputation had shifted from strays to respectable homesteaders. Jacob found himself smiling more. The silence in the cabin was no longer loud with grief, but filled with the soft sounds of life, the click of Sue's knitting needles, the scratch of Lynn's pencil as she tallied their accounts, the shared, easy laughter over a meal. He built a new room onto the cabin, and then another. He replaced the rough bench on the porch with a smooth, sturdy swing, big enough for 3. One evening in late summer, they sat on that swing, watching the sun set the western hills on fire. The air was warm and smelled of sage and dust and the coming rain. They were no longer 3 strangers bound by necessity, but a family, forged in the crucible of a harsh winter and a shared fight. Jacob looked at Lynn, her profile serene in the fading light. He remembered the fierce, terrified girl on the bench in town. He saw the strong, capable woman beside him now. He thought of the broken jade butterfly she had shown him, and he knew that here, in this unlikely place, they had found the missing pieces of themselves in each other. They had faced down the cold, the hunger, the law, and the judgment of others, and they had built something new. Something whole. It wasn't a grand fortune or a sprawling empire. It was just a home. But it was more than enough. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.